Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is The Raptor, and it's been a while, but today we're reviewing more of your favorite fight ideas. Remember, as always, to read the description or check my community tab to know how to contribute. It's important to follow those steps if you're interested. But if you just want to hear my basic thoughts about some versus matchups, aw, thanks. First up, Monokuma versus Korosensei, Danganronpa versus Assassination Classroom. I've seen this matchup pop up quite a bit recently, like it was in my most recent Death Battle Dream Season video when it got a Death Battle cast episode somewhat recently, and I'll be honest, I'm not super huge into either series or either character, but this is still my favorite idea that's been thrown around for either series for Death Battle, so I definitely think that means something. And I always understood like the base appeals for this matchup, like I totally get the stylistic appeals. Death Battle usually leverages those really well. I especially think back to Joker versus Giorno for, a more recent example. Plus, I also share a birthday with Korosensei, which I think is pretty cool. But other than that, I do think I've gotten enough into this matchup to understand the true appeals, or the more distinct appeals that this matchup has. For instance, I actually think this is like the best kind of contrast matchup that you can make. It's not built on contrast. It has one or two big contrasts that spice up the connections between the two, but it's not built on contrast to the point where I'm thinking, why is this even a matchup in the first place? And I really appreciate that. And that and the series' contents could allow for a really good and really intriguing script, in my opinion. And generally speaking, this matchup has enough wild cards and uncharted territory within the general versus community, at least, to be somewhat debatable or have some major talking points, as well as having a well choreographed fight. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I just think this matchup is really solid. It would absolutely be a contender for my top 50 most wanted death battles now. You can go check out that video too if you want to see it. But yeah, I am willing to bet that this one will happen. I definitely think it will happen at some point. It was a major Tournament of Champions matchup, and the crew has been learning more about Danganronpa through stuff like Death Battle Cast, maybe a little bit of ballot banter too, and it's been around long enough for the demand to be known. So yeah, I do have a lot of faith in it. Moving on, Aku versus the Lich, Samurai Jack versus Adventure Time. I gotta be honest, this is the kind of matchup that when I first see it, I get a little cautious, just because there are so many different parallels you can make between so many cartoon characters now, and I definitely think that applies to the villain side of things too, to the point where you might not be able to tell that this is the best match for each character just by looking at the matchup at face value. However, after having looked into the matchup a little more, I can say that I do think it works quite well. Death Battle does tend to use iconic heroes more in their battles, but this could be a fresh change if they wanted to change things up, and like I said before, I think that's always a good thing if they want to do that. And it's not just that these are villains, but they are pure evil for the demographic that they belong to, the kids shows that aren't afraid to get a little darker when necessary. And I think there are a lot of fun options for how to present that, just the ever-present forces of evil or forces of nature that are never going to go away on their own, and they just kind of have to be dealt with. I think that's a cool concept. And it's a concept that could benefit both how the characters are described in the analyses and physically portrayed in the animation. It's a matchup where most of the information will naturally be found in one spot, that being each of the respective cartoons, so it won't be too complicated of a matchup to analyze, which I don't think is an outright good thing. I don't think it's an outright bad thing. Just because some random guy could realistically watch both of these shows and get a good handle on who would win, doesn't mean that Death Battle should stay away from this matchup. They should do whatever matchups they want to do, regardless of the complexity to them, you know what I mean? And yeah, I wouldn't say that this is a match made in heaven. Like I said earlier, you might be able to find some other characters that work as well or almost as well for each of the combatants, but I still think that's okay. Not every episode that happens on Death Battle needs to be a match made in heaven all of the time. I don't think it's guaranteed to happen on the show, but it is an easy choice for a cartoon villain matchup. I certainly think Finn and Jake versus Mordecai and Rigby would happen first, but it's still a perfectly viable idea for the show, and whether or not it happens on the show, that's not going to change that. Next up, Waluigi versus Robbie Rotten, Super Mario versus LazyTown. Yep, we've made our way to this one. This is not a matchup that's been around forever. It doesn't massively transcend Death Battle or versus debating or anything like that, but at this point, it has made its mark in the community. You cannot deny that, and it seems to be seen as generally positive, like in a really positive light by most people. The These series have basically nothing in common with each other. They just so happen to have two characters that vibe really well together. For some people, that's enough for a matchup to really catch on. It doesn't always overlap with what I want to see out of my matchups, but I can still respect that to a degree. The potential for comedy gold here is undeniably the biggest prospect for a would-be episode. It's one of those episodes where I think the humor is just as important as the analyses. Normally, I would not say that whatsoever, but I think this is a very clear exception. And part of the humor comes from what these characters can do, which meshes really well with versus debating. You know, that's kind of the best kind of humor you can expect or that you could want for a versus debate because it ties in exactly with what the characters can do, so you can really kill two birds with one stone. It's a recipe for success if you ask me. I do feel like Death Battle would probably use General Mario scaling for Waluigi's capabilities. I know he hasn't really been in a mainline Mario game yet, but I don't see them saying that the Mario, Luigi, and all the other characters that are in the sports games are a different Mario and Luigi from the regular games, you know? So with Waluigi being able to do similar things to the other characters in those games, I think they will lean into regular Mario stuff at least a little bit. And if there's one thing I can knock against this matchup, which isn't really a knock against the matchup itself, but I do find it kind of annoying that everyone immediately flocks to this matchup when Waluigi does have other good, dare I say more unironic matchups on top of this. Like the ones I think too are like Mortimer Mouse or Dick Dastardly or maybe some other characters. But again, that's not really a knock against this matchup specifically. If you genuinely like this one the most, I think that's fine. I just think there are some other Waluigi matchups that would benefit from some more discussion time. And at this point, Sporticus might honestly be the first LazyTown character to come to the show. It's kind of hard to say, and I think it completely depends on what they want to do with Waluigi. Death Battle doesn't always have to do what the most popular thing is, but I could see them doing this as a WTF episode, so we'll just have to wait and see. After that, Doomsday versus 682, DC versus SCP. You've probably heard of this matchup already, and you probably have an opinion on it. At this point, it is the most widespread SCP idea in the versus community. There is so much active support and so much active disdain towards it that I have seen. There's just so many conflicting ideas on whether or not this should happen, how would this work, etc, etc. And I used to love this idea, like really love it for its unique debate. I think the variety of debating is a really underrated variety that should be present in Death Battle episodes. However, it is now a bit more complicated. I should say first and foremost that while there are exceptions, I don't usually like matchups where the survivability of one or both characters is the biggest issue. I understand that it being a death battle kind of implies that a character dying should be important to the outcome, but I much prefer it when characters can definitely die, or at very least when each character has a way of killing the other, like a pretty undeniable way of killing the other, and then it's the other factors that end up deciding what happens, like what the outcome is, because that's the more interesting stuff to me anyway. However, I will say that this one is so absurd in that regard, in just the survivability of the characters, that it's hard to not get intrigued by the concept of who would win, how would this go, what the hell could even happen here. It kind of comes full circle to being interesting to me again, so that's really cool. And I can definitely say that this is one of those matchups where the Death Battle cast episode influenced my opinion on it, but both positively and negatively, strangely enough, because the conversations that were happening on the Death Battle cast episode were super interesting, and it's just an amazing hypothetical in my opinion, like I said before. But I also can't help but think, was the Death Battle cast episode the best way to discuss this idea? Would trying to pair an animation with this super complex idea actually be doing a disservice to the matchup? Because how can you make it entertaining but also be truthful to what the fight dynamic is actually like and to how it would actually unfold? Is there actually a way to meet that middle ground? And like I've said many times before, you need to make sure that you can do the animation well before you turn a matchup into an episode of Death Battle. And I'm not saying that it couldn't work. They might be able to pull it off, but they need to be sure. They need to find that middle ground of being representative of what the fight is, but also being entertaining. So, you know, just having a normal discussion like on Death Battle Cast, was that the best way to talk about this matchup? It's hard to say. I do, however, think that the chances for this episode happening are higher than ever. It kind of feels like they might do it to test out SCP, like to see how it works, and if it works well, maybe they'll bring in one or two more characters later down the line, but it would definitely be a different experience no matter what happens, you know, and some people don't tend to take too kindly to that. So I'm just warning you that if you want this episode and if you get it, be prepared for something weird. Moving on, Kazuma Satou versus Subaru Natsuki, KonoSuba versus ReZero. This is probably the matchup in this video that I have the least to say about. I've seen it thrown around quite a bit before, some with positive opinions and some with negative opinions. I don't know too much about these series in general, but I do think that more light novels on Death Battle would be a very, very good decision. Naturally, we saw the beginning of this with Killua versus Misaka, and no, that's not my favorite episode in the world or anything, but I think they handled the introduction of a certain scientific railgun or a certain magical index and all that. I think they handled introducing that really rather well, so it gives me more faith for this episode happening and introducing these series. And generally speaking, I do think these combatants are very worthwhile combatants to get a Death Battle analysis. The connections between them are not necessarily uncommon, like you might be able to find elements of that, you know, in other characters, but I still think they are distinct enough to make it easy for the analyses and animation to pop comparative to the other episodes that would come before and after it. And light novels always have fun stories to cover. I mean, we're literally looking at half of the Isekai quartet here. I would expect to have some fun with this episode. Now, unfortunately, based on what I know about this idea, it does seem like there are elements of impossible or ridiculous survivability across one or both combatants, which again is not my favorite kind of matchup. It kind of sets off little red flags in my head, but it's also not the only thing that I judge matchups for, you know what I mean? Like, I am aware of some of the other appeals of this matchup, and I think if I had all the details or knew of all of the appeals, then who knows, maybe it would be enough to offset that negative for me. Now, Scott Pilgrim versus Kazuma being on the Tournament of Champions and getting more popular may throw a wrench in this one happening. Personally, I think I like this one more, but that's just me. Otherwise, I would say this has a decent chance of happening, not guaranteed, but you know, if they want to bring in more light novel characters, this would be a good way to do it. It's not the most popular matchup in the world, but a matchup doesn't always need to be to get made into an episode, so maybe this one will. Moving on, X versus Optimus Primal, Mega Man versus Transformers. I was kind of whatever on this idea for a while, but I'm just gonna come out and say it. I am quite into this idea now. X might be my favorite Mega Man, it's a little hard to say, but he's kind of just the one that I generally default to, and Death Battle Season 10 definitely got me a lot more interested in Transformers characters and Transformers lore. It's not a most wanted for me necessarily, but I would definitely say that I would appreciate seeing it now a lot. For one thing, I think X deserves his own episode. I can definitely say that without question, that he's big enough in the Mega Man world to deserve an episode that's not just the Mega Man Battle Royale. And there are series like Transformers or Power Rangers, for another example, where I think they deserve some more expansion than what they've gotten. We don't just want to see Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, we don't just want to see the big G1 Autobots or Decepticons. Like, exploring different avenues of these series would be amazing, and I think this would be a great way to do that. And sure, to the average Joe, this might seem like a bit of an unlikely combination, but I think it has more positives as a matchup than major clashes in its tone or its vibe or anything like that, and it still does decently well in those areas if you know enough about the characters. Categorically speaking, I just think this is a really strong idea. The connections are unique enough, the fight dynamic is interesting while also providing enough entertainment value and spectacle. There's tons of story information to talk about for both of these guys. It's very similar to Monokuma versus Korosensei to me. It's just a really solid idea. It doesn't really lack in a very specific area or have anything that really brings it down. Like, I just think it's a very, very solid idea. And I do have faith in this one happening, not as much as Monokuma versus Korosensei, but it is one of the more prominent ideas for both of the series right now, and it was a semi-finalist in the Tournament of Champions, so that definitely means something. I don't know how soon it would happen, but it feels like it's one of those matchups that they would just get to one day, so maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but sometime I could definitely see it happening, and I'd be very excited. After that, Perfect Cell versus Metal Sonic, Dragon Ball versus Sonic the Hedgehog. This one got real hyped up for a lot of people after the release of Bowser vs. Eggman, and also getting its own Death Battle cast episode. Feels like I'm kind of seeing a trend there. Although I want to address the elephant in the room first before I start. There are some characters out there that just do not have a perfect versus opponent, as much as we may wish that they did, and in my opinion, Cell is one of those characters. Out of his major opponents, I do think that Metal Sonic is the one that I know the best and probably like the best as a character, but if you've seen any of these videos before, you'll know that me liking both characters does not necessarily mean that I'm going to love a matchup that you put the two characters in. You know, how could it mean that on its own? And generally speaking, I think that this matchup works fine. I'm not going to say it works great. I don't think it works terribly. I think it works just fine. To be perfectly honest, the best thing about this idea is just that it's cool. Like, it uses fun characters in what would be a visually appealing fight. There's an interesting mix of abilities, some overlapping and some not. Like, it would just be total eye candy and entertainment value. From a production perspective, this could be a very, very well-made episode. I don't think anyone could deny that, even if you really hate this idea. I could also see some people arguing that this is the most thematic Dragon Ball vs. Sonic fight left, but there's still a very obvious power difference here as well, and I think that should not be overlooked. And it's not just obvious in the sense that if you know how strong the characters are, then you know how strong the characters are, but also in the sense that we've seen Death Battle use these series over and over and over again. We know how they analyze them. We know how they analyze the different eras of these series and how strong the characters can get of those different eras, to the point where I'm not sure if there's much of a point to doing this combination again. Like, is there enough uncharted territory in this combination? Are there enough surprises in what Death Battle is going to say that would make an avid Death Battle fan like me, who's seen all the other episodes, really interested in what they have to say here because of the prospect that it could be different? And frankly, I'm not really sure, at least not when you compare it to other options for these characters. So while I think the fight itself could be very cool, I think the discussion surrounding it in comparison would just be kind of boring. And for some people, a cool enough fight is enough for them, but I still feel justified in saying what I believe are the relative negatives of doing this episode, and that's why it kind of averages out to being fine for me. And I'm also a little torn for its chances on happening. Like, it is a very popular matchup. It's only gotten more popular. The series are popular, and, you know, I do think Cell will come to the show at some point, regardless of who he fights, but I don't know if Death Battle would bring Metal Sonic back again when Cell has other workable opponents. Even if Metal Sonic is your preferred opponent for Cell, you can't deny that you could pair him with other characters. So if they want to do it soon, I think maybe they would bring in someone else, but if they're fine waiting a few years, then yeah, maybe they'll bring Metal Sonic back. We really have no idea what's gonna happen. And finally, we have Master Splinter versus Master Shifu, TMNT versus Kung Fu Panda. I am happy to say that we are once again ending one of these versus matchup review videos with my favorite matchup out of the bunch. Go figure. This one ranked really well in my top 50 most wanted death battles video. I think it was like number 23, 24, something like that. So simply put, it's one of my favorite versus matchups ever that Death Battle has yet to do. I just love these characters, I love the series they're from, and I love the way that the series and the characters connect to each other, especially in regards to stuff like combat and intelligence and all that good stuff. With these characters being the strong mentor characters, there is so much skill and wisdom to incorporate everywhere. From an epic battle that shows off the full martial arts mastery of the characters, to the writing and the analyses that could be full of life lessons, the inspiring quotes, or hell, even the uninspiring quotes or the mistakes that they've made. I don't even care, just make the analyses or even just the animation dialogue chock full of that stuff, because that's the stuff that makes these characters important, and it's the stuff that makes them so special. I could see it being a little tough for Death Battle to find enough big things to talk about, because again, these are the mentor characters, they're not really getting the spotlight most of the time, and I'll be honest, I'm mostly thinking of Shifu when I say this, because he kind of takes a back seat in the Kung Fu Panda narrative after the first movie, although those moments still exist if you look at everything, like the ridiculous amounts of TMNT content that exist, or, you know, the Kung Fu Panda TV shows, because Shifu does play a big role in some of those, you know, so I don't think that's a detriment or a disadvantage to the matchup itself. It's just that Death Battle might have to work a little harder to find the right stuff to include to make the analyses as full as possible. But while I do really like this matchup idea, I'm not fully sold on its chances for happening. Like, it's not off the table or anything like that. It could definitely happen, but not necessarily soon. There are other TMNT matchups and other animated movie matchups that I feel like they may want to do first. That's just the way they tend to do things, but I will still hold out hope for this one because I really want to see it. I just think it's great. And that'll wrap up today's matchup review. Feel free to give your own thoughts about any of these ideas in the comments, and remember to read the description if you want to contribute in the future. Like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this from me. I thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, and peace out.